Prince William did not come to Ravensmere that wet morning to discuss leaking roofs. He arrived at precisely 8:46 through the eastern gates in a single dark vehicle, 2 solicitors stepping out behind him with matching black cases, and 3 antique keys already resting in his pocket that he had decided hours earlier would never be placed in Camilla's hand or her children's. No motorcade, no advance notice to the household, no courtesy telephone call. The Prince of Wales simply walked around the side of the Jacobean manor across wet gravel that shone under a low grey sky and let himself into the coldest room on the entire 12,000-acre estate. That room was the old estate office, the records chamber that had held the original land documents since the reign of Queen Victoria. Unheated, unloved, exact. By choosing it, he told every person inside the house, before a single word was spoken, exactly what kind of morning this was going to be. He had already rejected the grand staircase, the formal drawing rooms, the soft chairs arranged for difficult conversations to be softened with coffee and firelight. He seated himself where the paperwork lived, one hand resting on a cracked leather folder that still carried the faded gold crest of his great-grandmother. The keys remained in his pocket. He was not yet ready to show them. Camilla was informed at 8:59 that the Prince of Wales was in the building and thought nothing of it. 2 of the old lead roofs were failing. Historic plasterwork beneath them was at genuine risk of being lost before winter. Quiet conversations had already taken place about converting several of the outer cottages for members of her extended family. The king had supported the idea privately, never formally. 5 words had been spoken inside those walls often enough over 15 years to become furniture itself. You will always have Ravensmere. Her family arrived that morning expecting something undramatic, a private meeting, a few signatures on standard paperwork, everyone finished by lunch. Staff had already begun referring to a particular sunlit upstairs room as Mr. Parker Bowles's study, not as a joke, but as a location. Fresh flowers had been placed there before 8 o'clock so the space would look right. Architects had drawn renovation plans. Antique furniture had been measured against doorways to ensure it would pass through. A relative had spoken of moving horses down to the southern paddocks. Camilla's son had been given a quiet tour of the underground wine cellar and told which bottles belonged to the house and which he might open freely. Every one of those gestures was small. Taken together, they formed a pattern of ownership behavior sustained over years in front of paid witnesses who were trained to notice. William placed the 6-page legal opinion on the wooden table, looked directly across at Camilla's children, and spoke one sentence that did not merely change the morning, it altered the meaning of every year that had come before it. None of you were ever beneficiaries. He did not say the plan had changed. He did not say the king had reconsidered. He said that in every version of the paperwork stretching back decades, these people had never been intended to inherit the house. The sentence was careful, professional, and brutal in its precision. It did not accuse anyone of theft or overreach. It simply laid a documented fact on the table and allowed 6 people to absorb the consequences in silence. Every promise made under that roof suddenly meant something different. Every renovation plan became a question rather than a beginning. Every room they had begun to call their own had belonged to someone else the entire time. The obvious question, who then? He refused to answer yet. Camilla came into the estate office shortly after 9:20, visibly nervous, an unusual state for a woman who had spent years navigating the outer edges of this family with considerable composure. Charles followed a few minutes later. He was not nervous. He was angry. His jaw was set and his posture carried the particular stiffness that appears when a king believes the proper order of information has been disregarded. He expected the courtesy of being told before a meeting of this nature rather than during it. William did not stand when his father entered. That detail appears in every private account of the morning and is never treated as small. In that family, the physical signs of hierarchy are rarely accidental. Charles looked first at the table, then at the cracked leather folder beneath his son's hand. He recognized the faded gold crest before he recognized anything else in the room. It had belonged to his grandmother. The certainty left his face in a single visible moment. Ravensmere was never purchased by Charles with his own money. It was not given by the state. It is not crown estate property. The category most people assume covers almost everything connected to the monarchy. It forms part of a private family settlement put together decades earlier by a generation that understood precisely how quickly land and capital can walk out of a bloodline when no one is paying careful attention. The settlement had been amended 3 times. The First Amendment stop the agricultural land from being broken up and sold. The second protected the manor house itself from being stripped of its contents to pay for its own upkeep, a fate that has overtaken half the great houses in the country. Charles holds what lawyers call a life interest. He may live in the house, use the land, maintain it, spend on it, and take the income from the 2 working farms for the remainder of his life. It looks, feels, and behaves exactly like ownership. It is not. He cannot give it away, not by warm promise, not by handwritten letter, not by instruction from the sovereign, because the settlement is a private legal instrument and the crown does not sit above it. The King of the United Kingdom could not give that house away, even if he wished to. The solicitor opened the leather folder. The sound of the paper was the loudest thing in the room for several seconds. The decisive amendment had been signed and notarized in late 1999. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, died in March 2002. Charles married Camilla in April 2005. Beside the Queen Mother's noticeably unsteady signature stood a second, firmer one, written in a clear hand: Princess Margaret. Margaret died in February 2002, 7 weeks before her mother. Those 2 women signed the page together in the final stretch of both their lives. Margaret had been one of the original trustees of the settlement. Anyone who has read anything of substance about her knows what she was like concerning the family's private property: sharp, watchful, and thoroughly suspicious of anyone who arrived from outside the bloodline. At a trust meeting, she raised a specific concern. She was worried that Ravensmere could end up inside a new family through a future marriage that the original settlers would never have approved. She named nobody. In 1999, there was nobody to name. She needed only the wording. The solicitor read the clause in a flat voice without any emphasis at all, which is how those sentences land hardest. No spouse, no child of a spouse, nor any descendant unrelated by direct blood to King George VI shall ever acquire permanent title, controlling interest, or beneficial ownership of this estate. Camilla's children are not named in it. That is precisely what makes the exclusion more absolute rather than less. They were not barred as individuals after someone took a personal dislike to them. They were excluded as a category in advance, before either of them had ever heard the name of the house. 2 women in their late 60s and early 70s sat down in 1999 and built a legal wall around a piece of land high enough and specific enough to keep out people who did not yet exist in that family's life. The moment the name Princess Margaret was spoken, the meeting stopped being a purely legal discussion and became something personal. Charles leaned forward, properly angry by this point, and said he had never been told about that clause. William looked up at his father and answered with the sentence that finished the first half of the meeting: "You signed a sworn acknowledgement of it." The solicitor slid a photocopy across the table. Charles's own signature sat at the bottom of a page clearly dated November 1999. He picked it up. His hands were not steady. He turned it over, looked at the date again, then back at his son. For several seconds, the King of the United Kingdom had nothing to say. The technical explanation is genuinely persuasive. The acknowledgement was not a standalone document. It was buried inside a financial restructuring plan covering 6 different royal properties and running to roughly 100 pages. Ravensmere appears in it exactly twice, once under an obscure legal reference number and once under an old name for the estate that nobody in the family had used since 1936. A busy man in his early 50s signed where the pencil marks indicated and was told it was standard. There is a fair reading of what followed, and a harder one. The fair reading holds that Charles never registered what one buried clause did to one property among 6, and years later made a warm and genuine promise to a woman he loved about a house he believed was his to promise. The harder reading holds that he knew the clause was there and decided that when the time came he would find a way around it, because that is what had always happened for him before. The evidence that came next supports the harder reading. The clause was not unbreakable. It could be varied with the written consent of the surviving trustees. By that morning there was only one surviving trustee whose consent still counted: Williams. Months earlier, Charles had gone to his son about Ravensmere. He did not do it face to face. A proposal arrived through a trusted aide and described a plan for the estate as a continuity arrangement. That word turns up in this family every time somebody wants a temporary situation made permanent without anyone having to say so out loud. William read it and asked the only question that ever matters in these documents: who takes the ultimate benefit? The answer came back 2 days later. A new family trust would be established for the benefit of Camilla's children and grandchildren. He rejected it outright. No counter-proposal, no negotiation. The document went back with the word "rejected" written across it in black ink by hand. The second proposal was cleverer. Under that version, Camilla Camilla's family would never own Ravensmere at all, which kept the bloodline clause technically intact. Instead, they would take a lease, 99 years at a rent of £1. On paper, the royal family still owned the estate. In practice, William, his children, and his grandchildren would be locked out of that house for a century. By the time the lease expired, everyone alive on the day it was signed would be dead, and 4 generations of another family would have occupied the manor. Every photograph, every local newspaper cutting, and every planning application in the county would carry their name. Possession that long stops being a tenancy. It becomes the original settlement contained a further safeguard sitting further down in the part that deals with the management of the land rather than the ownership of it. Any lease granted over the estate for a term longer than 21 years required the written approval of all living trustees. The 2 women of 1999 had not only stopped somebody being given the house, they had stopped somebody being given the use of the house for long enough that ownership would stop mattering. William rejected the second proposal as well. At that point, the door was not merely closed. It was 3 weeks later, private contractors arrived at Ravensmere. They were not there about the lead roofs, and they were not there about the plasterwork that everybody agreed was at risk. They carried out a detailed residential survey. They measured the west wing. They went through the historic kitchens, assessing them for modern installation. They spent a morning working out whether the old nursery corridor could be converted into a set of luxury family apartments. Nobody told the Prince of Wales any part of it. The assumption clearly was that he would. William noticed because of an invoice, not a whistleblower, and not a tip-off from staff. An architectural survey charged at £18,400 sat in the estate maintenance account between a roof repair and a line of routine agricultural spending where anybody skimming the page would have gone straight past it. The description on it stopped him. Future occupancy, adaptation, and spatial planning. Every word in that phrase was doing work. Occupancy means somebody living there. Future means not now. Adaptation means changing the building to suit. He requested every invoice, receipt, and work order attached to that estate going back through the relevant period. It took days to go through. What came out was not one survey. There was a substantial order for custom-built furniture, mahogany shelving cut to fit specific walls, a temperature-controlled tasting room off the cellar, 2 full bathrooms specified for permanent residents rather than guests, and on the delivery paperwork in the box for the authorized recipient was a name, not the king, not the queen, Parker Bowles. That is the moment the matter stopped being a difference of opinion about the future of a house. A promise costs nothing. A survey costs money. A furniture order with somebody's name on the delivery note is a person behaving like an owner in a document that a third-party company keeps for 6 years because the tax authorities require it. Back in the cold estate office, Camilla made the argument that was available to her, and it was not a stupid argument. Nobody had taken anything. The surveys were preliminary. The furniture had not been installed. No lease had been signed by anybody. In strict legal terms, nothing had happened. All of which is true, and none of which is the point. William was not there to prove a theft. He was there to establish that a family had spent years and a considerable amount of somebody else's money preparing to inherit something they had never been entitled to inherit for one single day. Her son pushed the folder away across the table and said the only thing anybody in his position could say. They had acted on direct assurances. William gave him 4 words back quietly. Assurances are not ownership. Nobody in that room needed to ask where the assurances had come from. There was exactly one person in the world who could have given them, and he was sitting at the end of the table with a photocopy of his own signature in front of him. Charles turned on his son at that point and said, "This could have been kept private." William answered without heat, "It was private until trust money was spent on it. Once those invoices existed, a trustee who noticed them and did nothing had a problem of his own. That is the trap Charles walked into without ever seeing it." Camilla stopped arguing. She stopped defending the furniture. She stopped defending the surveys. She stopped talking about what had been promised to her children because she had worked out something that had not yet occurred to anybody else in that room. Ravensmere is not unique. Settlements like that one govern a great deal of what that family lives in and lives off, and most of them have never been read properly by anybody currently living. If William was willing to go through the accounts of one estate line by line and put 2 solicitors in a car at 20 to 9 over it, the question stopped being about this house. The question became what else he was going to look at. That is a woman recalculating her entire position in about 15 seconds. She changed the subject, and the question she asked was the right one. If her family were barred from the estate, who inherits it instead? William did not answer her. He looked at the solicitor and nodded. The solicitor turned to the 4th page. On the death of the king, his life interest ends. hands. The whole of the Ravensmere estate then passes to the next eligible beneficiary determined by the acting trustees. Camilla's daughter interrupted, and there was relief in her voice because she thought she had spotted the obvious ending. Well, that is obviously William. He is the heir. Everybody in that room thought so. Everybody reading about it afterwards would have thought so. The eldest son, the future king, the last surviving trustee, the man who had spent months blocking every attempt to move the estate anywhere else. Of course he was keeping it. 9 days before that meeting, he had legally renounced his claim to it. The document had been executed, witnessed, and lodged. It had sat there quietly for over a week while everybody in that house carried on believing they understood what the fight was about. He never wanted the 12,000 acres. He never wanted 2 failing lead roofs and a manor house that eats money faster than 2 working farms can produce it. He has Highgrove, he has the duchy, he has more property responsibility than any private landowner in England, and a role approaching that will take everything else he has. He wanted one thing only, the power to decide where it went. Once he had that, the house itself was of no interest to him whatsoever. By renouncing, William activated a contingency clause that had been sitting dormant in that settlement for 27 years without ever being triggered. The estate would pass to the next royal sibling named in the 1999 amendment. Harry is not named. He does not appear anywhere in that amendment and cannot, because the wording was drawn in a way that follows a specific line, and he sits outside it now in every practical sense. Anne is named and eligible, yet she had already removed herself in a sealed declaration lodged with the trust on the grounds that the responsibility was not something she wanted. Andrew is named, and by the time that page was written, he had been ruled out entirely by a provision triggered when a named beneficiary withdraws from public duties on behalf of the Crown. The withdrawal from public duties happened in 2019. Whoever drafted that provision in 1999 was not predicting any specific future event. They were building a general rule that a person who steps away from the obligations of that family should not then collect its private property. The rule caught him decades later exactly as written. That left one name. Camilla's son leaned forward and said the 4 words that have traveled further than anything else out of that room. Read that again. The solicitor read it again, in the same flat voice. Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, the brother who has spent his entire adult life being described in the press as the least interesting member of that family, doing a heavy diary of small engagements in regional towns that never make a front page. He was the next eligible beneficiary of a 12,000-acre estate, and he had known about it for weeks. William had told him, of course, you do not activate a dormant clause in a private settlement and let the person it lands on find out from a solicitor in a room full of people who are about to lose it. Edward accepted. No announcement, no statement, no photograph on the steps of the house. In a family where 3 of the last 4 major stories have been about money, access, or scandal, being unremarkable for 4 decades turns out to be its own qualification. He accepted with one condition attached, and the condition is the reason this story is worth telling at all. Ravensmere would not be his home. The farms, the cottages, and every pound of income the estate produces would go into a new charitable structure. Wounded veterans, bereaved service families, young people aging out of the care system with nowhere to go and nobody to call. And the manor house itself, the Jacobean center of it, the part with the rare paintings and the wine cellar and the sunlit upstairs room, would become accommodation for the families of serving personnel who are in long-term medical treatment. The relatives who currently sleep in hospital car parks and travel lodges for months at a time while somebody they love is being put back. He inherited an estate and gave away everything it could ever earn him in the same afternoon. Sit with what that does to the room. Camilla's family did not lose Ravensmere to a rival. Losing it to the future king would have been survivable, and in a strange way it would have been dignified, because you cannot be humiliated by the crown taking back its own. They lost it to the quietest man in that family who took one look at 12,000 acres and decided he did not want any of it for himself. William slid the 3 antique keys across the table. He did not hand them to Camilla. He did not hand them to his father. He passed them to Prince Edward's solicitor in front of everybody, which is a piece of theater from a man who does not usually do theater. 3 keys is a strange number for a house that size because they are not working keys. Nobody unlocks a manor with an antique iron key in 2026. Those 3 are the ceremonial set, the ones that hang in a hallway and get handed over when a house changes hands. Everybody in that room had watched them hang under the king's portrait for years without thinking about what they were for. The heaviest key opens the archive room, which is where the settlement documents live, and giving that one away way first is its own statement. The second opens the front doors of the manor. The third is small, and it opens a chapel on the estate that almost nobody uses. Edward had been inside that chapel once in his life as a boy with his grandmother. The signed agreement contains one carve-out from everything else. That chapel is the only part of 12,000 acres reserved for his own family, not to live in, not to use, but to remember her in. One room out of a Jacobean manor, 42 cottages and 2 farms, kept back for a memory of a woman who died in 2002, and who is, if you follow the paperwork all the way down, the person who decided the outcome of that morning. Charles finally spoke, and his voice had gone. "You arranged all of this without telling me." His son answered him without any heat at all. "You already made your own arrangements, father." That is the sentence that settles the fair version and the hard version of what Charles knew in 1999. If he had genuinely forgotten what he signed, that reply would have been unfair and out of character, and William would not have made it. He made it because both of them knew about the aid, the continuity proposal, the 99-year lease at a peppercorn rent, and the contractors measuring a nursery corridor 3 weeks after the second refusal. Camilla asked the last question of the meeting, and it is a very human one. She asked what happens to the rooms they had already prepared, the ones they had paid for. The head solicitor closed his folder, and that sound is how the morning ends. Everything goes back to the original estate inventory. The custom shelving comes out. The wine collection stays locked. The study upstairs stops being called what the staff had started calling it, and within a month nobody will use the phrase at all, because staff in that world take their vocabulary from whoever is current. The flowers that somebody had arranged in that room at 7 o'clock that morning so it would be perfect for him went out through the back of the house before sunset. By the evening, the small nameplate on that upstairs door had been unscrewed. No announcement came out of any palace. No statement corrected anything. Nobody in the press was briefed by anybody on either side. Visitors driving past those gates that week saw a country estate looking exactly as it has looked for 400 years. The entire episode was absorbed without a ripple because everybody involved had a reason to want it forgotten. Charles because of the signature, Camilla because of the invoices, her children because of the study with their name on the door, the 3 keys used to hang on a hook underneath the king's portrait. They are not there now. They sit in a plain wooden box beside a photograph of the Queen Mother. On top of them, Edward left a note with 7 words. "Let this house belong to those who need it." Camilla spent 15 years being told she would always have Ravensmere, and she believed it. She was entitled to believe it because the man who said it was the king, and he said it in his own house. She never once asked to see the deeds. By the time somebody finally read them out loud to her in a cold records office on a wet Tuesday morning, the only thing left with her family's name on it in that entire estate was a brass plate on an upstairs door, and by dinner that plate, too, was gone. That family has spent 30 years demonstrating what happens when things are agreed warmly and written down nowhere. It cost Diana almost everything she owned, and it cost her sons a decade of arguments about what had been hers. It is the single most reliable way that house has ever found to hurt its own people. The son who watched it happen used the same weapon twice in one morning. He held his father to a page from 1999. He held his stepmother's family to a delivery note with a name in the wrong box. Neither of those required him to raise his voice or say one unkind thing about anybody. 2 elderly women in 1999 saw an outsider coming years before she arrived and built a wall she could never see. A grandson found the wall still standing 27 years later and put a door in it that leads somewhere none of them expected. The house did not pass to the future king. It did not pass to the family that had been preparing to occupy it. It passed to the quietest brother in that family, who looked at 12,000 acres and decided that the only proper use for them was to serve people who had already given more than most and needed a place to rest while the cost of that service was still being paid.